Welcome back, guys. We are now on video 3 for chapter 8. We had discussed Keynesian beliefs, and now we're going to zoom in a little bit closer. Now, what does Keynes think of wage rates and interest rates? We know that classical economists think that they are at equilibrium. We know that. They tell us they are at equilibrium, don't you worry, there's enough competition in the economy and this is all you need. Which means you don't have to worry about housing shortages, you don't have to worry about stock market crashes, you don't have to worry about medicine shortages, you don't have to worry about excessive surpluses that lead to recessions, none of that. Doesn't really exist much because there's plenty of competition. Of course, Keynes comes in and says, hello, excuse me, I don't think that's the case. I think that the economy would be mostly in some sort of recession unless the government were to actually intervene and do something about it. First point, wage rates are inflexible. When something is inflexible, it's rigid, it doesn't move very much. How come when the classicals say wages are flexible? Because when you believe that a wage can exist at equilibrium, then you believe it has the ability to go from a surplus down to an equilibrium, or from a shortage up to an equilibrium. Because if you remember, a shortage means prices are too low, they have to rise. A surplus means prices are too high, they have to drop. Where to equilibrium? Keynes says that's good, that's hunky-dory, but that is not really what often happens. What often happens is the economy is in a state of surplus, meaning businesses aren't really able to move their merchandise enough, therefore they're not able to replenish their merchandise enough. And if you ask why, now I have to remind you, Keynes died in 1946, 1945 or 1946, I think 1946, right after World War II. So he lived at a time before when unions didn't have much of a say, until a time when unions were growing in popularity and strength. When unions came onto the picture, unions would now tie an employer into a contract that would last 2 to 3 years. The problem with classical theory is that it says in the long term you have equilibrium, and Keynes comes in and basically says in the long term we are all dead. He's saying in the short term, you can very much end up with situations that last a long term. Because if a union contract steps in and says wage rates have to be this much for the next 2 to 3 years, then that is the long term. And you no longer have free competition in that market because the seller or the producer or the manufacturer, remember they're all the same, does not have the ability to adjust the wage up or down until the contract expires. So therefore, that flexibility is gone out the window. Now we fast forward to today. Does everybody have a union? No. Are most people union members? Actually not. You're looking maybe about a 12% of the labor force that is actually unionized. Well, that is changing a little bit lately. I'm sure you've been reading about the Starbucks locations, for instance, that have been getting together and getting unionized, right? And there are other examples like it as well. Employees are looking to get back some of the power that they gave away for several decades now. So unions are making a comeback, and that inflexibility is returning. But you cannot say that Keynes's point of view is that most employees and most employers are locked into some sort of contract that takes away the flexibility. That is actually not correct today. Now, as far as interest rates are inflexible, why does he say that? Classicals say they are flexible. Interest rates are the price of borrowing. The idea is if banks have too many applicants, too many people want, like for instance, a mortgage, we've seen that recently, then they raise the interest on mortgages for people. When too few people apply to attract people back, they lower that interest that they are actually offering on mortgages. Well, he's saying they are actually also inflexible. And if you ask Keynesians, well, why, or at least Keynes, the idea is that the price level is constant. That is one of the conditions of the Keynesian school of thought, is that the price level doesn't fluctuate and go up. The idea is an economy goes into a recession and hits a slump, and now you have like a flat line, which is kind of funny that I should say flat line, because when a person flatlines or any living entity flatlines, that's a heart goes into literally like a beep that's even, right? And he's saying an economy can be pretty much be almost dead as the price level drops and then lingers. Well, does the price level do that? Here's what I will tell you historically. When there are recessions, the price level will drop, and most likely, there are always exceptions, and might go up and down, but within a low range. It's not going to spike up, spike down. It's not. I mean, a recession is like a sickness. When a person is sick, what do? They go lie in bed, they take medication, right? It's just that economists disagree on what the medication should be. And they disagree whether the doctor should be the government who's able to prescribe medication. But we know what happens when someone is sick. We take a rest. Well, if you're taking a rest, then you're not doing a whole lot. The economy is relatively lacking in friction, in movement, and therefore that's going to make prices stagnate as well. So it's a stagnating situation for wages. It's a stagnating situation for the price level. Therefore, he's going to say it's inflexible. Is that an extreme description? Probably. But as you know, to make theories really correct, you cannot do that. You isolate, you use the ceteris paribus, and you impose conditions. Now, here is his other thought about why, even in times of booms and busts, you cannot count on flexibility from interest rates or flexibility from wages. He gives examples, and remember, he died in the 40s, so he witnessed the Industrial Revolution, he witnessed World War I, he witnessed the Great Depression, he witnessed the booming 20s before that, he witnessed World War II, he witnessed a whole lot, and the world changed drastically. But they were massive booms and massive busts, and during that time, competition continued to be in jeopardy. So when we say, why does he think that? This is why he thinks that. Here's what he says to us. In times of booms, take the Industrial Revolution, you had oligopolies and monopolies that really took over. As you know, the history of the United States is not of royals, it's not princes and queens, it's tycoons, it's JP Morgan, for instance, it is the Astors, it is Rockefellers with oil, right? Those are the big names, or Carnegie, as he used to say his name. So a monopoly, we know what it is when one company exists in the market and 100% of the market share belongs to them. Oligopolies, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but instead of mono as in one, it's a few. So now you have a competition amongst very few. So yeah, you don't have just one, but you don't have 15, you have 2 or 3. Maybe 4 max. They tend to be codependent, and they tend to copy each other, and they tend to have a big chunk of the market each. We see that today in airlines, for instance. And if you take micro, I'll end up getting into that with a lot more detail with you. But he is saying, look, here's the economy booming during the Industrial Revolution. Most markets were either monopolies or oligopolies, and that still led to lack of competition in all the major industries that count. Oil, major transportation, coal, grain. Even today, I mean, one of the criticisms of farming is that there really aren't a lot of small mom and pop farms as much as there are huge industrial farmers that own massive percentages of the overall farming in the country. And so you go back to this oligopolistic behavior. During times of busts, and he uses the example of the Great Depression, he's going to say, okay, so here's the Great Depression. The economy is the Great Depression was a decade pretty much between 1920 to almost 1930, 1929. And during those almost a decade, there was like a W. You had a recession that was more severe at its worst in 1933. And then there was a short-lived recovery, and then another recession, but not as bad, and then a recovery. We didn't really get out of that hellhole until basically World War II brought with it a huge demand for goods and services. You see what I just told you here? I just told you demand creates its own supply. And so to Keynes, businesses collapsed, lots of businesses went out of business, and that created another situation of lack of competition. So what he's doing here is he's taking a hammer to the concept of competition is all you need to keep prices at equilibrium, and he's saying, good luck with keeping competition as strong as you need it to be. It is not always robust, even during times of booms, never mind times of bust. A little note down here. To classical economists, prices, wages, and interest rates are flexible and unrestricted. To him, what are they? Inflexible, right? So keep that in mind when we are doing a comparison. We're going to move on to video number 4, so bye-bye for now.